out of it, or agitate the hell out of it, and try to make it release naturally on its own accord. And many times,
one of the suggestions I've read about that is they call it splash racking, where you just mix everything up and then rack it into another carboy and let it splash the crap out of itself rather than going in with a leaster or something like that. And that way you get everything. You'll transfer everything from one carboy to the other because you're mixing it up while you're racking it, but also splashing around in a nice empty carboy that's full of air will get you more than just shaking it around in the inch and a half of headspace you've got in your carboy.
Oh. Yeah.
Yeah, and so that brings us to the other question too. Somebody asked is, can using sulfites with the letter T cause a sulfide defect? And even though they both contain sulfur, not usually. They're different chemically. So that's not a usual. The sulfides that come, they appear to come from sulfur-containing amino acids that the yeast may use when they're under stress. And there's other sources of that sulfur also. But the sulfites, if you oversulfite, it's not going to smell like rotten eggs. It's going to smell like burnt matches. And I've done that too. I was going to do an acid addition with tartaric acid, and I measured this white powder and I put it in, and then I should have smelled it. I would have been so obvious if I was actually able to smell it. It was like I added I don't know how many times of the potassium metabisulfite, and I tried to measure the sulfites in there, and I had to actually dilute it and go through, and it was like 80 parts per million sulfite, and I was like, oh my gosh, and it smelled like burnt matches, and so what can you do to fix that? Well, when it's that high, that's probably not really fixable because your bound levels will be too high. And what did I do? I just saved it. Of course, it would never go bad, but I used it as a way to add sulfite to my other batches, and then I could just do the math and say, okay, if I add so many cups of this to this other one, it'll raise the sulfites by that amount. And so I ended up not having to pour it out. I just slowly poured it into other batches as I needed to add sulfite. So it was my sulfite solution in a way. But yeah, that was kind of an embarrassing mistake that nobody knew about until I told you guys today. But
well, and Tom, I don't know if you remember, but I did the same thing to 16 gallons of strawberry mel that I made. I had a bunch of stuff up on my tables ready to sulfite, and I went through and did that with all of them, only to realize that I had done that last week with these 2 batches and didn't realize that I had done it double. And I tried to save it, and throwing another 1,000 pounds of strawberries at it wasn't the answer, and I too now have a lot of nice strawberry flavored sulfites.
Yeah, and if you oversulfite, so we want to use sulfites appropriately. We don't want to oversulfite. Too much is not good. It might not give you headaches, but it won't taste good, and you can bleach it out. You can bleach out the fruit color and all of that. But there are ways if you slightly oversulfited, so just simply racking it can do that, because the SO2 gas it'll blow off, and that's why I'm not so shy about being aggressive about sulfiting early, because you're going to have some particulate matter in there. There's going to be some leaf settling out. There's going to be binding when you first put the sulfites in, which I'll talk about more in a moment. But and so you'll have time for the levels to decrease. I try to be a little bit more careful because you don't want to overdo it, and then I'm ready to bottle it next week, and it's like, uh-oh. But if that's still too much, you can actually use hydrogen peroxide very, very carefully, because if you don't measure it, you're going to ruin your mead by oxidizing it. But there are actually formulas for using just over-the-counter 3% hydrogen peroxide to lower your level of sulfite. And again, this is really going to need to be done by somebody who can measure their sulfite. If you've overdone it and you can't measure it, then you're not going to know what you're doing, and it's going to be really hard. But I suggest if somebody does it, they use one of the calculators. They measure very carefully. I think the last time I had to do this in a batch of mead, I think I used maybe 7 milliliters or something, a very tiny amount for a 5-gallon batch. And then I dissolved it in water first, because you don't want to just squirt it in there, because it's going to start oxidizing wherever it touches but not get dissolved. So that's another trick if somebody accidentally didn't measure. But that really high one I told you about, I mean, that one was way too much to get rid of in any other way other than just sort of disperse it. And it was a traditional mead, so it wasn't going to change anything. It wasn't like it was a strawberry that, maybe I didn't want to put the strawberry into some of my other ones.
Could you blend it and use the excess sulfur to protect the full blended meat?
Yeah, that's what I did. Yeah, I just, the one batch I really over-sulfited, I just, I blended it with other ones that needed some sulfite additions, and I just used that, and it worked just fine. Yeah, I do a lot of blending. I have a hot pepper meat that I made, and I made some really good ones, but this one I left the peppers in too long, and I'm like, but I'm not worried about it. I'm going to blend it back with the original batch, with another batch that I made of that same fruit flavor, and I know exactly what ratio I need to do. So blending is another technique that is really helpful for meat makers, and I don't want to get too far off. We're supposed to talk about sulfites tonight, but blending would be blending and taste testing is another good topic for the show down the road, because I think when you make beer, you kind of make beer, and you follow your recipe, get your measurements, and then it's kind of done. And I know there's some beer brewers that are doing some blending, but it's not as much as winemakers. Winemakers do a lot of blending because every year the wine is different, or even within your own vineyard, you can have different grapes, and so there's a lot of blending that goes on in wine, which I do a lot of that with meat also, which I never did originally. But anyway, back to sulfites. Let's not talk about blending too much. So when I started, I mean, like a lot of us, we use the Camden tablets, and that's the one source. I now use the potassium metabisulfite, or the KMBS, the K-Meta. It's a lot cheaper, and when you're doing big batches, it's just easy to measure using a scale. Again, you have to pay attention to what you're measuring, though, so that you don't overdose it. But I use the potassium metabisulfite. I dissolve it in some water and before I add it to my batch, and then I stir it slowly. You can also make up a 10% sulfite solution too, and there are calculators online that let you do your sulfite additions with using a 10% solution. That might be if you're doing a really big batch, or maybe even a commercial. Folks might be wanting to use make up a 10% solution that they'll use up for various batches. So another thing, so there's different types of sulfite. So when the sulfur dioxide is into the mead, it basically becomes bound, or it's free, and that's a concept that I'm a biologist in training, and so there's biochemistry involved, but I did not like organic chemistry, and chemistry was something I had to know, but it wasn't something I loved. I mean, some folks love chemistry, and now I can understand it, but yeah, it's not, I like living things, I like flowers and vegetables and bees, and meat is alive too, at least in the beginning. So, I mean, I like living things and growing things. So chemistry is, so when we talk about sulfite, what we measure usually is if we're going to be measuring, we talk about free SO2 or free sulfite, because that's the form that actually has the antioxidant and the antimicrobial effect. Sometimes we talk about total SO2, and that's basically it. It's the total amount that is in the mead, so it's the bound and the free sulfite together. And to make it even a little more complicated, the free sulfite is basically the bisulfite and then the molecular sulfite. And the bisulfite has some antioxidant effects, and that's the part that reacts to certain enzymes, and it binds to compounds like acetaldehyde. And then that bisulfite is eventually going to become bound, while the molecular sulfite, that's what has the antimicrobial effects. So when we're trying to determine how much free sulfite we want to have in our batch, and what level we want to maintain it at, we're really trying to aim for a certain level of a molecular sulfite. And the range varies, but for a red wine, they recommend 0.5 milligrams per liter. For a white, they recommend 0.8, and then for a dessert, you can get up to 1.5. So with mead, I'm usually aiming for 0.8 and 0.8 milligrams per liter, and I think that's what most folks I've talked to, that's what they're aiming for also. And so that molecular is going to change depending on the pH, and this is where it gets complicated. When I first started, I thought, well, you put in 4 or 5 Camden tablets in a 5-gallon batch, and you'll have 50 parts per million, and that's good enough. And I couldn't test it, and I didn't know, and I was just guessing. But some of that you add is actually going to become bound, and so if it's bound, it's not available. It's not protecting your mead from oxidation or from microbial activity, and it's going to change depending on the pH. So if the pH is lower, you're going to have a higher amount of molecular SO2 compared to if your pH is higher. And so that's why the free SO2 you're aiming for may be lower if you have a higher, maybe, let me get this straight. Your free SO2 may be lower if your acidity is higher or if your pH is lower, versus if your pH is higher, you're going to need to add a higher amount of free SO2 to get the same molecular SO2 that you're aiming for of 0.8. Yeah, this is very confusing, but there's a lot of calculators online and that's what I usually do. I just enter the numbers and I enter the pH. But before I was testing, I thought what I was doing was enough. And then when I started testing my sulfites, it was all over the place. And I would do an addition based on the pH and based on the volume. And then usually what you do is you wait 24 hours, you go back and retest. And sometimes there wasn't anything there. So the base, and I don't test the baseline sulfites so much anymore, but I used to out of curiosity. But I would do an addition, and let's say I was adding 40. I would check it the next day, and it was like 10 parts per million. And it's like, where did it all go? And that's because of binding. And so what happens with the sulfite when you add it is it'll stick to things, and some will become bound to, like I mentioned, the acetaldehyde and the polyphenols, which are the tannins and the color compounds. But it'll also bind to other things. So if there's any yeast left, like if it's a cloudy mead, it'll bind to the yeast particles. If you have any lees in there of any significance, it'll stick to that. And so I found that those calculators online are not always so accurate. You enter your numbers, you enter your data, you put your sulfites in, and you go back the next day, and it's not anywhere close. Usually it's much less. And so what I started doing is I started guessing and compensating by, at least for my first edition or other situations, I would give more, sometimes 30% more, sometimes 50% more, or if it was really, I would actually double the amount. And that would get much closer to the ballpark. And I know that Shea Comfort talks about that, and there's a nice manual from More Wine Making. It's very helpful, and they go through and explain, the binding that you need to worry about. But yeah, my first edition, I tend to add more than the calculator tells me to compensate for the binding. If it's a cloudy mead versus a clear mead, if it has any lees on there and I'm planning on getting it off of the lees, I will rack it first and then add the sulfite. If I do it the other way, it'll just get all sucked into the sediment, and then you leave the sediment, and there went a lot of your sulfite. And then if it's an oxidized mead that I'm trying to fix, if it's even salvageable, I'll add extra because it'll bind to the acetaldehyde, and then there's going to be a lot of more dissolved oxygen. Usually, if it's an oxidized mead, you would expect that, and it would help fix that also, possibly. But with the later additions, there's going to be a lot more bound sulfite, and then the calculators are actually pretty close. So with the second and third ones, then that's going to be much closer. So then the calculators are a lot more reliable. That's something that I didn't, it's not in a lot of books. I mean, it is, but it's kind of buried there. And unless you really dig into how to use sulfites, you're going to be like, where the heck did they go? I wasn't racking it. Where did it go?
Yeah, this question came up on I think it was the Facebook Got Mead page recently, and a couple of people said that they actually would sulfite their meads while it was still sitting on the yeast cake before they racked it, which I said was a terribly bad idea, and I'm now getting confirmation that it is actually a bad idea because a lot of that would bind to the yeast, right? So you definitely want to rack it and get it as clear as possible before sulfiting. Is that correct?
Yeah, you definitely want. If you're planning on racking it, you should really rack it off the leaves and then sulfite it.
Yeah.
But I'll jump in here just for a second. Sorry to interrupt, Tom.
Yeah.
Uh-oh.
And we lost
Where'd
Ryan.
he go?
No, he's still online. Ryan, turn your mic back on, dude.
I thought it was me who disappeared. That's good.
No.
Hello?
There he is.
Hello?
Yeah, we lost you for a second there.
So you'd like to jump in here, Ryan.
See what happens when you interrupt Tom? See?
Yeah, right. Yeah. So I spoke last week, and I said this is something I do that, and one of the reasons that I feel like I can do this is because I actually have an analyzer. But I get kind of lazy, and I actually sulfite, sorbate, and cold crash all at the same time before I've racked off all of my stuff. And I do this to save racking losses that you lose from racking. And knowing